Okay, thank you very much. And I certainly agree that I'm not possibly going to cover everything that was said, and you don't want me to anyway. However, there was a reasonable amount of commonality as well as lots of individual ideas. I think the common point that everyone started from is that this is a new world, that there are a set of expectations about the world that the world that kids are coming from. Someone used the phrase that kids are born into this culture and they have an expectation that this culture will be reflected in their educational environment. But on the other hand, I heard someone else saying, but you've got to be careful, kids aren't all the same. We believe they all want to collaborate online, perhaps some don't, and we have to acknowledge those different learning styles and those different needs. So we want to be a little bit careful that we don't make too sweeping a set of generalisations. However, it is a world where I heard that Twitter could become part of the curriculum, as could Wikipedia, and I suspect that's already happening in some places with good media studies teachers and English literacy teachers. People talked about the importance of personal learning spaces for students as well as for teachers, the importance of connecting the learning that's occurring outside of school and outside of formal learning environments with what happens inside. Heard some interesting discussions about that. There are some people who are feeling uncomfortable about the notion of undirected learning, about unstructured learning, and the importance of recognising that the teacher does have a professional and valued role in structuring and guiding and directing learning, and we need to balance that with the drive for the more informal self-directed learning that perhaps can be better supported in this new world of technology. I heard about the new forms of delivery being used to address the old problems of remoteness and distance, and the potential of technology to find new solutions, and the thought that perhaps those new solutions may in fact not be just applicable to distance but also become mainstreamed. There was quite a bit of discussion about barriers. One barrier was perceived to be teacher capacity, and I heard quite a lot of conversation about that. I heard that teacher capacity is the single most important factor in student achievement, and there's some research that backs that statement up. So how do we develop a capacity that suits the new agenda? How do we provide teachers who can change, teachers who have agility with a new skill set? One person commented that the VET Flexible Learning Framework has been a pretty effective model in providing opportunities for people to change, and there may be some learnings that we can take away from that to bring to the other sectors. There's quite a bit of conversation about rewards, the need to provide incentives for teachers to change, the challenge of scaling up from the 20% who currently have good practice to the 60% who need support. How do we motivate, encourage and reward those? Is it financial? Perhaps not. Is it certification? Maybe they don't want a certificate. So there's a challenge there that we need to address. There were conversations about the national curriculum and its role in this space. It needs to be responsive to disruptive pedagogies, and similarly the national assessment needs to be reflective of this new world. And I think I heard a reasonable amount of pessimism about whether in fact that's likely to happen. And perhaps the challenge is to make sure that as we develop a national curriculum we acknowledge this new culture and this new world. People talked about barriers to access. I think it was practitioners who were saying very realistically it's all well and good to talk about a new paradigm, disruptive technologies, but if the kids can't get access to the technologies, if they're not expecting to have a computer on their desk when they go to school, then it's a nice idea that's very hard to put in practice in the reality of the classroom. There was some discussion about sharing good practice. It was agreed there needs to be conduits for sharing, and those conduits could be applications that provide a structure for sharing. But again, that was countered by comments that unless any clever application that can provide a conduit for sharing is supported by people who will promote that application, it's not likely to get picked up. There needs to be investment in the people that sit behind the program as well as the program. Somebody said that content alone won't cut it. So in conversations about sharing content, people recognise the value of content. I didn't hear people suggesting that's not important, but again it's that notion of where there has to be support wrapped around this content in terms of giving a mechanism for teachers to identify quality content, current content, up-to-date content, and better understanding about how they might use that content within a classroom environment. There was a conversation about sharing open content. How do we promote sharing? How do we encourage people to create content and then use an open license means to share it? There's some questions there about ownership, and we need to have those matters resolved. Again, there's a question about rewarding as well. It may be that people need some sort of incentive to share. And one person pointed out in the higher education community there's a particular challenge with regard to sharing content because one's achievements within that community are often highlighted through being published in professional journals, etc., which is kind of pulling away from the notion of communities sharing materials. Speaking of communities, there were some discussions about that, recognition that communities are happening, that children are on communities at home. Bebo got a mention. Questions about are our children safe, whether they are or not. Children are using those communities, and how do we as educators respond to that? Somebody said that perhaps virtual communities are more real than schools. People choose to go to a virtual community because they are motivated to be there. Perhaps they don't go to school always for the same reason. And maybe we need to make some links between the motivations to form a virtual community within the classroom, and the classroom can be a place that supports virtual communities as well. Speaking of communities, there was a conversation at one table about Indigenous communities. People recognised that there's enormous potential for technology to support Indigenous communities, that it does make a difference. But there was some concern that what we do is trial lots of things, and we find often that these things that we trial work, but then we move on to something else. And the comment was made, how do we systemise this stuff? How do we put in place programs that have some longevity? Once we know something works, how do we make sure we leverage from that and use it again and continue to extract those benefits? But on the other hand, the comment was made that with many Indigenous communities, the opportunity for those communities to have access to the content and some self-directed time is in fact possibly all that is needed. And perhaps a telling comment towards the end that I heard was there needs to be a paradigm shift not only in the way teachers perform and how practitioners work, but also at the policy level. That there needs to be a paradigm shift here too, that we have to become, as policymakers, more gutsy and less risk averse. So I think there are many barriers that were mentioned, such as firewalls and fears associated with the dangers of an online environment, but perhaps as policymakers we need to recognise that we need to support and enable this world rather than perhaps lock it down for the sake of the safety aspects.